Good morning, East Coast US. Good afternoon in the UK. Late afternoon in Israel. It is Monday, February the 3rd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 486 days old. I'm your host, temporary, Jonathan Conricus, former IDF spokesperson and a senior fellow here at FDD. I'm filling in for Jonathan Chanzer. Don't worry, he will be back on Wednesday. And welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. We are at limbo. Not quite at war, but definitely not safe. Not from Hezbollah, not from Hamas, not from the Houthis or from Iran. Our enemies are prodding and checking the limits of Israeli tolerance during these tense days of ceasefire in Lebanon and in Gaza, and so far Israel remains steadfast in its implementation. It remains to see for how long we will remain that. Obfuscated by the grotesque reality show a la Hamas and Al Jazeera of the release of Israelis from Hamas captivity, in Judea and Samaria, the pace and intensity of operations is ramping up. Israeli, and you can see it on the map here, in Tulkarem, in Jenin, and in Nablus. Those are the areas of operations. In global events, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C. to meet with key U.S. officials and with President Trump, as the future of the region literally is on the line. Wherever you focus your gaze, there is lots to unpack, but today we're going to shed some light on a less discussed area and try to learn what good can come out of the Horn of Africa. Today's guest is Rageh Omaar, a Somali-born British journalist and writer with a prolific and diverse career. He has served as a BBC World Affairs correspondent, achieving global recognition for his coverage of the Iraq War, and now holds the position of International Affairs Editor for ITV News in the UK. Omaar has won numerous awards for his outstanding reporting and has lived and worked in many combat areas, including in the Middle East. He possesses deep and personal knowledge of the region and expertise on the rising terrorist threats emerging from the Horn of Africa, which is why I sought him out as a guest for today's program. I'm looking forward to our conversation in just a few minutes. Now, the Islamic Republic of Iran is both threatening and flexing new military gear while wooing the West and the US to engage in negotiations. They're cunning and they're patient. Maybe they're banking on global attention, focusing on UK or US-China trade, on Russia and Ukraine, on the new or perhaps old Syria emerging, on Greenland or the Panama Canal, instead of on their nuclear military program. Well, if there's one US think and action tank that will not drop the ball on this absolutely crucial topic, I can assure you that is FDD. Regarding Gaza, I just want to emphasize one thing. In war, to defeat your enemy, you search for his center of gravity, and once you locate it, you hit it as hard as necessary until your enemy disintegrates or surrenders. For 16 months, Israel has fought Hamas and dealt the terrorists from Gaza severe blows, but we haven't forced them to surrender. In my mind, as long as we don't deny Hamas their source of sustenance and power, which is the goods flowing into the Gaza Strip, they, Hamas, will not surrender, and this war will go on. Sounds simplistic? It isn't. Is it hard to do with a steep military and diplomatic price? Most certainly. But that is what it takes to win this war. I suggest we keep that in mind as negotiations officially start today for the second anticipated phase of the deal to free the remaining 65 Israeli hostages in Hamas captivity. Now for two headlines. Headline number one, Iran has unveiled a new underground missile factory and storage facility. This is a naval facility. It is reportedly located somewhere along Iran's southern coast, and it is run by, no surprise, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. On Saturday, Iranian state TV aired footage showing this so-called underground city stocked with hundreds of cruise missiles. The newscast also revealed a new model of cruise missiles that IRGC chief Hussein Salami said could create hell for ships at sea. Then on Sunday, the Islamic Republic unveiled a new type of ballistic missile at a ceremony in Tehran. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian was present for the big reveal. The missile, called Trust in Farsi, is supposedly capable of traveling 1,700 kilometers or just over 1,000 miles. In case you were wondering the distance between where Tehran is and Israel, yes, that means that the missile can reach Israel and beyond. Headline number 2, Qatar is prepared to welcome Palestinian prisoners released during the ceasefire. Are you shocked? I'm not. Yesterday, Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani said that released prisoners are welcome to come to Qatar as long as their relocation is based on their own decision. Here we go again with terrorists receiving safe haven on Qatari soil. Of course, we knew this was coming. As part of the hostage for prisoner swap deal with Hamas, brokered by, amongst others, Qatar, Israel asked that the most serious offenders not return to Gaza or Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Egypt agreed to temporarily host the terrorists, while Turkey, Qatar, and potentially other countries are serving as final landing spots for these terrorists with blood on their hands. Already, 70 ex-Hamas members released from Israeli jails have made their way to a hotel in Cairo, and the former prisoners say they are stranded in the hotel, unable to leave. This brings us now to the interview. Let's go to the interview with Rageh Omaar. With his extensive career in journalism, he's gained deep insight into the complex dynamics of the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, of course, Europe, and beyond. I'm thrilled to welcome him onto the program. Welcome, Rageh. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very good, Jonathan. Nice to be back with you.
Yes, and it's great to be in reverse positions. Usually you ask the questions and tell the story, I answer. But today we have the opportunity to tap into some of your extensive expertise about the region. And I'll go straight to it. Let's speak about the Horn of Africa. I'm quite confident that a lot of people who are listening and viewing are experts about the Middle East, but my bet is that they know less about the Horn of Africa. So if you would, please give us a kind of 101 analysis specifically related to conflict, terrorism, jihad. What's the state of affairs in that region of the world? And how is that influencing the Middle East?
Let me start off by first of all saying how deep historical links between Israel and the Horn of Africa is, and also, of course, the Arab world and the Muslim world. I started my career, my first ever broadcast for the BBC World Service was from Ethiopia, just after the so-called, I don't know if we still call them falashas, but the Ethiopian Jewish community was airlifted in a daring operation out of end of the 80s, 1992. And I went there. I have family in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, in Somalia, and in Somaliland. So the links are very deep. The other thing I would say is that after October the 7th, the conflict between Israel and its adversaries is now way beyond the Arabian Peninsula, and it is present in the Horn of Africa. Why? Not just because of the Houthis, but because it involves the United States, the European countries, and also economies in Asia, because we are at a pinch point. If you look at the Horn of Africa, it's a number 7, right at the top there, as you see it. 22% of global trade between Europe and the Mediterranean and the Middle East passes through that pinch point. So suddenly, what has happened in terms of the Iranian proxy powers now involves the Horn of Africa.
Right. It involves the Horn of Africa, but there's also, before the Iranians came, northern Somalia and Somaliland, of course, saw lots of instability, and we have significant presence of different Sunni jihadi organizations, Al-Shabaab, and most recently, a local offshoot of ISIS. So how does that balance in, and how would you describe the situation on the ground now when it comes to hostility towards the West, towards the US, towards Israel? And how would you put that in a context of history? Is it getting better or is it getting worse?
I think it's getting worse, Jonathan. I mean, as we're speaking now, I think 24 hours ago, President Trump ordered airstrikes just neighboring to Somaliland on ISIS positions in just Puntland. They are just 30, 40 miles from what is purported to be potentially a new US military base in the port of Berbera. So this is an active, ongoing situation. Also, the largest franchise of Al Qaeda is not in the Middle East. We have to bear this in mind. It is in Somalia, right? It's the largest tax gathering organization from Al Qaeda. ISIS is there. They are now in the Middle East, Al Qaeda and ISIS used to be adversaries. In Somalia, in the Somali region, in the Horn of Africa, on the Straits of the Red Sea, they are partners. That hasn't happened anywhere else, I don't think, anywhere in the Islamic world. So I think this is now a center of gravity in the sort of jihadi world.
Right. So let's unpack a little bit. We've spoken about terrorist organizations very briefly and non-state actors. Let's speak a little bit about state actors, because many countries, because of the strategic and geopolitical location and importance, many countries are meddling in the Horn of Africa. If you could say a few words about Turkey, about Iran, about China, and really break down what this area means, and that will then take us to what the future may hold for the region and why it matters.
Okay, so you have to look at Somalia and Somaliland are two different historical experiences.
Right. Let's bring back the map, and we can see Somalia and Somaliland. Somalia more to the north and east, and then Somaliland slightly towards the west, with the major city Berbera along the coast in the central part of it, just for people watching. Yes, please.
So Somaliland was a British protectorate, and that's very different from the rest of Somalia, which was an Italian colony. And that matters because in Somaliland, what was British protectorate Somaliland, there were only a few, 300-400, British colonial officers in the 50s, right? In Italy, it was a proper colony. So Somaliland had, when decolonization came, a sort of there was the British left behind, and I'm not trying to big up colonial experience here, but there was a rule of law, and there was a protective political and military force in Somaliland. Why does Somaliland have a different historical experience to Somalia? Because I think that in the south of in what is today Somalia, the historical experience was very, very different. So let's fast forward, okay? I don't want to get into a sort of deep historical sort of lesson here, but Somaliland broke away from Somalia in 1992. It set up a sort of established organization, and they've had 5 democratic transfers of power. And if you're looking at in a very hot area, in terms of strategic politics today, Somaliland would be a safe bet.
In contrast to obviously the very unstable situation and violent situation in Somalia, but let's focus for a second on global and regional power players in the region. I know that Turkey has tremendous investments in Somalia in different jihadi networks, as well as in so-called humanitarian and charity operations and economy. We know of Chinese involvement and tremendous investment in Djibouti and elsewhere. There's, of course, tensions between Ethiopia and neighboring Somalia and Somaliland and Djibouti. But let's try to tell me how this ties in to Iran, Israel, US, and perhaps where there's a possibility for something positive to come out of this very restive region.
The strategic anchor for the north of what is called Somaliland, is Ethiopia and the United States and the UK. The strategic anchor for Somalia is Turkey and Qatar. And that spells a very different narrative domestically. Somalia, I would say, is part of the broader, what I'd say, Muslim Brotherhood investment. And some of that is just economic. Somalia has a very long coastline. It's allegedly very rich in maritime blue economy resources, and I think that's basically what Qatar and Turkey are after. But in order to have that, they have local partners who are part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Somaliland doesn't have that. I think Somalia is trying to invest in local actors that would like to be part of the Muslim Brotherhood. They haven't found any. They haven't found any takers. So let me say this, Jonathan. In the last 33 years in which Somaliland declared independence, it's had one terrorist attack. Now that's a pretty amazing statistic if you count where I'm talking to you from, the UK or France or anywhere else,
or Israel, yes,
or it's managed to manage that situation. So you have a very distinct ideological investment between Somalia and Somaliland.
Right. And by the way, you mentioned Qatar and their so-called investments or dealings in the region. I mean, we're both in very closely related to. You're in the business, and I'm on the margins of media. Let's discuss for a second influence operations and how the war is reflected. I mean, you have an illustrious career in media, BBC and many stellar networks, but you also worked for Al Jazeera.
I did.
From an Israeli perspective, looking at this war, looking how close and intimate the ties are between Al Jazeera and Hamas, and to a certain extent Iran, but mostly so Sunni terrorist organizations, looking at how invested Al Jazeera is in these, for instance, hostage release ceremonies that are choreographed and very well managed from a media perspective. Just as a media professional, what's your take on where Al Jazeera is today? How different is it from 14, 15 years ago when you worked there? And what's your take on that network and organization?
Okay, I joined Al Jazeera at its foundation. I'm talking about Al Jazeera English.
Right.
Not Al Jazeera Arabic.
Yeah.
So it was a very disruptive, new kid on the block. I'm talking about 2006, right? So right. I was working for the BBC. I was based for 6 years in Iraq. And Al Jazeera Arabic was a very, amazing new kid on the block. And they decided to found Al Jazeera Al Jazeera English.
Right.
And it was, it was a very formative organization. But this is my personal view. This is not to do with ITV or anyone else. I decided to leave it because I felt it lost its way. Why do I feel it lost its way? Because it, became what I think is a part of Qatar's foreign policy influence.
Right.
And that's strengthened. I can't speak. I mean, I was in Israel on October the 9th. You and I spoke a few days after the horrific attacks, and I haven't been back since then. So I think that Al Jazeera is a part of Qatar's foreign policy.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would personally extend that further. And we are, of course, at FDD monitoring them quite closely as an organization, as a tool of influence, as a supporter and amplifier of terrorists. But we'll leave it at that. And I'd really like to thank you, Rageh, for coming on, for sharing some of your vast and intimate knowledge about the Horn of Africa, its challenges, and what maybe we can see like as something positive for the future, looking and perhaps enlightening people about Somaliland versus Somalia and the stability and democratic traditions that have really gained strength in there, and of course how this ties into Iran's regional war against Israel and instability in the Middle East and beyond. So thank you very much for being on the FDD Morning Brief, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you. And now to wrap things up, here is what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's David May recently joined the Israel Connection podcast to discuss his new monograph, which traces the history of anti-Israeli boycotts, from the Arab League's 1945 boycott of pre-state Israel to the rise of the so-called BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that we are familiar today. He also addressed Israel's decision to ban the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, whose well-documented ties to terrorist organizations, specifically Hamas, are a stain on the already very tarnished brand of the United Nations. Joe Truzman from the FDD's Long War Journal has a new piece analyzing the reactions of Palestinian terrorist groups to Israel's counter-terrorism operations in Judea and Samaria, what I spoke about in the beginning. As the IDF dismantles terrorist infrastructure in northern Samaria, specifically in Jenin, but not only, these groups have released statements and videos claiming to deploy small arms and IEDs against Israeli forces. And of course, this is a growing terror threat that, of course, Israel needs to stop before it spills over and hits Israeli civilians in other areas. Third, last but not least, I encourage you to check out the latest episode of FDD's Foreign Policy podcast, hosted by none other than FDD's founder and president, Cliff May. This week, Cliff spoke about the latest developments in the Middle East with American foreign policy specialist David Vermser. Be sure to have a listen to that conversation wherever you get your podcasts. And that is it for today. If you're looking for more in-depth analysis on a variety of topics related to foreign policy and national security of the United States, just check out our website at fdd.org. And of course, make sure to read our quick takes on X, formerly Twitter, at FDD. And we have Instagram and YouTube channels, and they're actually pretty good. I encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss any important or new content. Tune in Wednesday for another episode with the main host, Jonathan Chanzer. He'll be back, and he will be joined by Professor Eyal Zisser, an expert on the Middle East and specifically Syria, who serves as the vice rector of the Tel Aviv University. And I will be listening to that, and I encourage you to do the same. Thank you for being on today. Looking forward to the next time. I'm Jonathan Conricus, signing off for FDD. Shalom.